Cedar Creek Medical's emergency department hums with the particular chaos of a Tuesday morning in Denver, fluorescent lights buzzing like angry wasps, the rhythmic beep of monitors stacked on top of each other, the squeak of rubber wheels on polished tile. Ambulance bay doors whoosh open and closed. Phones ring. Someone pages a code blue that never comes. The smell of antiseptic hangs over everything, sharp and chemical, cutting through the metallic scent of blood that no amount of cleaning can fully erase. Ashley Cooper moves through this controlled bedlam like water finding its path. 8 months at Cedar Creek. 8 months of arriving 30 minutes before her shift, 8 months of staying 30 minutes after, 8 months of being the nurse everyone forgets to thank because competence is invisible and mistakes are what get remembered. She checks the fall line on a post-op patient in Bay 3, her hand steady and certain as she adjusts the drip rate. Exactly 42 milliliters per hour. The patient's eyes flutter toward her. She doesn't smile, but her voice comes out soft. That's going to feel better in about 3 minutes. It does. It always does. The laceration repairs come next. A man with a gash across his palm from a hardware store accident. A teenager who thought jumping a fence was a good idea. A woman whose name Ashley never learns but whose trembling hand Ashley steadies by simple proximity. The resident, Dr. Chen, maybe a year out of medical school, still bright-eyed and burning with the need to prove something, fumbles with the 5-0 suture. His third attempt at closing the teenager's arm. The stitches are uneven, the spacing wrong. Ashley steps closer. Not a request. Not a demand. She simply moves, and Dr. Chen steps back because some people fill spaces and some people make room. Her hands take the needle driver. 8 stitches. Perfect spacing. Tight enough to hold but loose enough not to strangle tissue. 90 seconds. The teenager watches like Ashley has just performed actual magic instead of basic surgical technique. Dr. Marcus Pierce sees this from the physician's station. He's been watching Ashley for 3 months now. 47 years old, chief of emergency medicine, educated at Johns Hopkins, married to a partner in a downtown law firm, house in Cherry Creek that costs more than most people's annual salary. His presence fills a room the way a predator fills a space. There's a tension to it, a sense of something that could turn dangerous if provoked. Right now, he's leaning against the counter with a coffee that costs $9, and his eyes are following Ashley like a hunter tracking movement in tall grass. The thing that bothers him, really bothers him, the kind of gnawing itch that won't resolve, is that she doesn't make mistakes. Not the small ones that would give him purchase. Not the documentation errors or the judgment calls or the moments when a nurse reaches beyond her scope and he could document it, report it, build a case. Ashley Cooper is a nurse with a generic background, a BSN from some school that doesn't appear in any rankings he recognizes, references that check out but feel thin somehow, like someone built her credentials in a workshop rather than accumulating them through actual work. And yet, the residents defer to her. The attending physicians, not him, never him, but the others, occasionally ask her opinion before they move forward. The patients calm down when she's in the room. The staff works faster when she's present. There's something about her, something in the way she moves through the ER with the kind of economy of motion that most people never achieve, something in the absolute steadiness of her hands and the flatness of her effect that suggests she's seen things that matter. She's just a nurse. A competent one, fine. But nothing that should command the kind of attention he's noticed lately. Pierce's jaw tightens as he watches Ashley move from Bay 3 to the supply closet. That's where she goes during breaks. Alone. She stands there for exactly 5 minutes, her hand on the small of her back, her eyes closed. He's timed it. He's watched through the small window in the door. Nothing remarkable about it. Decompression. Every nurse does it. But something about the way she does it bothers him, the absolute stillness, the kind of meditation that suggests practice. A lot of practice. The trauma alert comes over the intercom at 10:27 a.m. Motor vehicle accident, 2 vehicles, 3 patients, ETA for minutes. The ER transforms. The controlled chaos suddenly has a direction. Trauma Bay 1 is being prepped. Trauma Bay 2. The attending physicians position themselves. The residents gather at the periphery, ready to jump in if needed. Ashley is already moving before the second announcement finishes. She doesn't run. That's the thing Pierce notices most. Everyone else shifts into crisis mode, faster movements, elevated energy, that particular frequency of stress that rises in the ER when something serious is incoming. Ashley's pace doesn't change. She walks from the supply closet to the trauma bays the same way she walks to get coffee. But her hands are already doing three things at once. Drawing up medications from the Pyxis machine. Laying out sutures. Checking the crash cart. Her muscle memory moves independent of her conscious mind, and Pierce realizes, not for the first time but with renewed irritation, that she's done this before. Not in an American emergency department. Somewhere else. Somewhere that required this kind of automatic competence. The first ambulance pulls up to the bay at 10:51. Pierce is in Trauma Bay 1. He positions himself at the head of the stretcher because that's where the hierarchy says he should be. Excellent positioning. Clear command structure. The paramedic is giving vitals, BP 92/58, heart rate 114, respiratory rate 24, conscious but confused, significant abdominal trauma with distension. The patient is a male, maybe 30, pale as paper, and bleeding from somewhere that the paramedics can't see well enough to stop. Ashley is there already, starting a second full line even as the first is running wide open. The patient's blood pressure is dropping. This is the kind of situation where panic is reasonable, where mistakes happen because the pressure is enormous and the clock is ticking and everyone knows that people die on trauma tables sometimes despite everyone's best efforts. Ashley's hands are steady as surgical steel. She's asking questions while she works, allergies, medications, last oral intake, her voice pitched low enough that only the paramedic and the patient can hear it. The rhythm of it is almost meditative. Movement and speech synchronized like she's done this dance 1,000 times. Pierce watches as she places the second four with a single smooth motion, no hesitation, no trembling in her fingers, just the absolute certainty of someone who has threaded needles into veins under far worse conditions than a brightly lit American trauma bay. The resident, Dr. Valenti this time, a third year who's usually solid, freezes for just a moment when the attending physician in Trauma Bay 2 calls out for help with a chest tube. That moment is all it takes. The routine fractures slightly. The machine hesitates. Ashley's voice cuts through it, flat and clear, 14 gauge, left second intercostal, mid-clavicular. She's not addressing anyone specifically. She's not commanding. She's simply stating facts the way someone states the sky is blue, and Dr. Valenti's hands move faster, and the crisis settles back into its grooves, and everyone does their job. Pierce watches from his position at the trauma bay, and he sees the way the nurses around her are gravitating toward her station. Not consciously. Organically. The way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet. They're watching her for cues. They're waiting for her quiet confidence before they proceed with their own tasks. By the time the patient is stabilized, BP back up to 102, rate dropping into the 100s, the worst of the bleeding controlled, the room has reorganized around Ashley's quiet competence. She's not the attending physician. She's not the surgeon. She's a nurse who somehow became the gravitational center of the entire trauma response without ever raising her voice or demanding anything. Pierce sets his coffee down on the counter with enough force that it sloshes slightly. He's still thinking about those references. About the way Ashley moved in the supply closet, like someone preparing for combat. About the faint scar on her left forearm that she never quite covers, even in the summer when everyone else is rolling their sleeves up. About the small patch sewn into the lining of her jacket pocket, he caught a glimpse of it once when she was changing out of her scrubs, some kind of unit insignia, faded now, the kind of thing people don't carry unless it means something. The next words out of his mouth will set the tone for everything that follows, though Pierce doesn't know that yet. He's just a department chief annoyed at a nurse who's somehow making him look less authoritative by simple proximity to competence. He doesn't understand that he's about to start a cascade of events that will ultimately unravel his entire career. He doesn't see the ghost of Baghdad in the way Ashley moves. He doesn't know who he's standing next to. Right now, he's just thinking about how to remind everyone exactly where the hierarchy sits. He approaches the nurse's station at 12:23 p.m. Ashley is charting the trauma case, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she uses for everything else. Pierce sets his fresh coffee down. He's gotten a new one, a darker roast, the expensive kind, and he leans against the counter in a way that positions him slightly above her, his angle calculated for maximum visibility to the other staff members. "Tell me, Ashley," he says, loud enough for the residents to hear, loud enough for the nurses gathering near the supply station to catch the tone of it, which is pleasant on the surface but carrying something underneath that makes the room's temperature drop by several degrees. "Where did you say you trained again?" She doesn't look up from her typing. Her fingers keep moving. Her face remains exactly as it was, composed, neutral, the kind of face that gives nothing away. When she finally speaks, her voice is soft. Deferential. Exactly what someone who is just a nurse, someone with questionable credentials and a thin background, would sound like when challenged by the department chief. "BSN from University of Colorado, Doctor." She pauses. Still typing. "I mentioned it during orientation." Right. Pierce's smile is sharp, a blade disguised as warmth. "And before that?" "Before the nursing program." The silence that follows lasts exactly 3 seconds. Then Ashley's hands stop moving. She turns to face him, and for just a moment, so brief that no one else probably catches it, her eyes are empty of everything except a kind of vast, tired knowledge. Like she's seen this particular dynamic play out so many times that she could recite his next 5 questions without listening to them. "Military service," she says quietly. "Like I mentioned. 3 years as a corpsman before I transitioned." "Corpsman." He lets the word sit there. "That's Navy, right?" "Combat medicine." "Field work, mostly." Her answers are too short, defensive in a way that feels deliberate. Like she's being careful. Like she's hiding something. Nothing I need to detail here. This is the moment Pierce settles into. This is what he's been waiting for. A crack. A hesitation. Proof that beneath the steady hands and perfect sutures and the way everyone gravitates toward her opinion is someone who doesn't quite belong, someone whose credentials don't quite add up, someone he can slowly, methodically, systematically discredit. He doesn't know yet what she actually is. He doesn't know that the unit patch in her jacket is from a naval facility in Baghdad. He doesn't know that her military service was something far more specific than field work. He doesn't know that the reason she never talks about her background is that most of it is classified, sealed, locked behind the kind of security clearance that makes normal personnel files look like open books. Right now, he's just satisfied that he's found a thread to pull. And he's going to pull it carefully, methodically, until the entire carefully constructed cover story unravels. Ashley closes her charting window and stands. She doesn't meet his eyes. She simply moves past him toward the supply closet, the same way she's moved 100 times before, her shoulders steady, her walk unhurried, her face a perfect mask of professional composure. But her hand brushes against the small patch sewn inside her jacket pocket as she passes, and in that gesture is something that would terrify Dr. Marcus Pierce if he understood what he was actually looking at, not a nurse defensive about her credentials, but a soldier who has neutralized threats far larger than a department chief with a god complex and too much free time. The ER returns to its normal rhythm. Monitors beep. Ambulances come and go. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song. But something has shifted. And by the time anyone else notices, it will be far too late to stop what comes next. The resident's hand shook as he reached for the laryngoscope. 17-year-old boy, blunt force trauma to the anterior neck, trachea collapsing like a crushed straw. The family stood in the corner of Trauma Bay 3, their faces a map of terror. Mother. Father. Grandmother with her hand over her mouth. The boy's O2 sat dropped to 71. Dr. Pierce stood at the monitor, arms crossed, watching. Waiting. Ashley moved closer to the resident of Marcus, fresh out of nursing school, sweating through his scrubs. His breathing had gone shallow. His jaw was clenched. She could see the tremor in his forearms as he fumbled with the equipment tray. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't touch him. She simply existed beside him like a compass finding north. Second intercostal space, she said quietly. Midclavicular line. You're not inserting a tube. You're opening an airway. The needle goes perpendicular, not at an angle. Marcus's eyes flicked to hers. He was drowning and she'd thrown him a rope. 14-gauge angiocath. You have this. Her voice carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Breath sounds will return. The boy will live. Your hands know what to do. The boy's O2 was 68 now. The monitor's beeping had become a metronome of panic. Marcus steadied himself. He positioned the needle. One controlled breath. The angiocath slid through skin and muscle to the pleural space, and the hiss of air escaping was like a sigh of relief from the universe itself. O2 climbing. 72, 79. 85. The boy's color returned. His chest rose and fell without the desperate gasping that had filled the room seconds before. Sinus rhythm. Stable pressure. Alive. The mother's hand dropped from her face. The father's shoulders released tension they'd been holding for 90 seconds that had felt like 90 minutes. Grandmother whispered something to God. That's when the door swung open with the force of a fist. Dr. Pierce. Eyes locked on Ashley like a radar targeting system. Ms. Cooper. He said her name the way a prosecutor says objection. He stepped toward her, his voice rising to fill every corner of the trauma bay, ensuring every ear in the room bent toward his words. This is wildly inappropriate. Your presumptuous behavior has no place in patient care. Step back immediately. The family's eyes shifted. Confusion rippled across their faces. The gratitude that had been forming evaporated like rain on hot asphalt. Marcus looked between them, his relief turning to uncertainty. Ashley's jaw tightened. She could have spoken. Could have explained that the resident needed guidance, that the boy would have died without those 10 seconds of instruction, that coaching a team member through a crisis was not overstepping, it was medicine. Could have referenced her nursing degree, her certifications, her 8 months of flawless evaluations at Cedar Creek Medical. She did none of those things. She stepped back. Hands dropping to her sides. Face a mask of stone. Pierce moved into the space she'd vacated, dismissing her presence the way a wave erases a footprint from sand. The family watched him take over, and in their minds, the narrative had already rewritten itself. The nurse had been improvising. The doctor had saved their son. This was the correct order of things. The boy was moved to ICU. Stable. Extubated within 18 hours. Discharged 5 days later. His mother never looked at Ashley when they walked past her in the hallway. 3 days later, the break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness that comes from a room where people eat their regrets. Ashley sat at a corner table, the one by the window that overlooked the parking lot. A sandwich. Black coffee. Her badge clipped to her scrubs next to her name in white letters, A. Cooper, RN. 3 nurses entered, Stephanie, who had shown her the locker room on her first day, Christine, who had covered her shift when she'd requested a day off in August, and Jada, who had brought her homemade tamales and said, "You need real food, not vending machine garbage." They saw her. Stephanie's pace slowed. She glanced at the others. Christine whispered something. Jada's face shifted, not unkindly, but with the particular awkwardness of people suddenly remembering they had somewhere else to be. They got their coffee. They left without sitting. Ashley chewed her sandwich. Methodically. 1 bite. 2 bites. Her hands were steady around the bread and turkey. She watched them go, her expression unchanged, though something behind her eyes had gone very still. The next afternoon, the break room again. Same table. Different nurses. Same exit. And the next day. And the day after that. By the following week, staff had stopped trying to hide it. Conversation simply died when she entered a room. Mid-sentence, mid-laugh, the words would trail into nothing. People would gather their things and scatter like startled birds, leaving her alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the fluorescent lights that buzzed like something trapped in a light fixture. She ate alone. Every meal. Her jaw set the way a jaw sets when you're bracing for impact. Her hands remained steady. She didn't look away from her food. She didn't flinch. She didn't join the spaces where other nurses clustered near the sinks, didn't attempt conversation, didn't reach out to bridge the sudden distance that had opened up like a chasm in the middle of a floor that had always felt like solid ground. Because she knew exactly what had happened. Dr. Pierce's voice, careful and concerned, in corners where she wasn't standing. Her references seem remarkably thin, doesn't anyone think? I've been trying to verify her previous position, and it's almost like, well, I don't want to speculate. But the hospital should probably look into it. A pause. A troubled expression. I just think we have a duty of care to ask questions. The same conversation, different versions, passed from nurse to nurse like contaminated blood through a transfusion line. Her questionable references. Her evasive past. The way she'd overstepped with Marcus. The way she seemed to know things a floor nurse shouldn't know. Where exactly had she worked before? No one could quite remember. Why had she been so vague about her previous position? Nothing was provably false. That was the genius of it. No accusations. No concrete statements. Just questions. Just concern. Just the toxic seed planted in soil and watered with doubt. Ashley finished her sandwich. She drank her coffee. She observed the staff in their clusters, the casual glances toward her that ended quickly, as if looking directly at her might contaminate the viewer. These were good nurses. Competent nurses. Nurses who worked overtime because patients needed them, who cried in supply closets after losing kids, who celebrated births and mourned deaths and showed up the next morning to do it all again. Now they looked at her the way you look at a door that might not open from the inside. She set her empty plate in the sink and rinsed it with methodical precision. Water ran over ceramic. The faucet squeaked slightly as she turned it off. No one looked up. No one acknowledged her return to the kitchen. It wasn't a request. It was a command: you do not belong here. She returned to the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next would change everything, and none of them saw it coming. That evening, as Ashley was prepping the supply cart for the night shift, she noticed something. Gerald Hoffman's cardiac monitor showed him awake in his room, reading a visitor log tablet. She'd been assigned to check on him as part of her routine rounds. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest her interest was anything other than standard patient care. She'd been monitoring Hoffman for 6 weeks now, tracking the visitors who came in the early morning hours before the day's shift, the ones who stayed for exactly 15 minutes, the ones who carried nothing but left with items. The pattern was tight. Professional. Military, even, in its precision. Naval intelligence had told her one thing 8 months ago when they'd created her identity, when they'd given her a nursing license that would hold up under scrutiny and a background story that would satisfy HR and a small apartment in Denver that would be searched in exactly the ways they expected. Don't get caught. Don't reveal anything. Don't break cover for anything short of an active threat to national security. She hadn't broken cover. But Dr. Pierce was building a case against her, and that case might lead to her dismissal, which would mean losing access to Hoffman, which would mean losing the supply chain that naval intelligence had spent 2 years mapping. She pulled out her phone during the break between rounds. No one was watching. No one was ever watching her anymore. She opened the camera. Hoffman's room was visible from the medication station if you angled the phone correctly. She photographed his visitor log. The names. The times. The signatures. 3 minutes later, she had what she needed. She was closing the phone when a voice like a tank idling in a garage spoke from behind her. Interesting hobby. Dr. Pierce. Still in his white coat at 7 p.m., standing between her and the exit like a door that had decided to lock itself. Patient documentation, Ashley said flatly. She didn't move. She didn't explain. She held his gaze with the kind of composure that only comes from having stared down far worse than a jealous physician. I've been reviewing your case file with administration, Pierce continued, his voice taking on the texture of satisfaction. Your references. Your background. Remarkable, really, how little information there actually is. It's almost as if someone went to considerable effort to obscure your prior employment. Ashley said nothing. I'm going to recommend a full credentialing review, he said. I think the hospital board needs to understand exactly who they've hired. Don't you? She met his eyes. Held them. My license is current and verified, she said quietly. Pierce smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he'd already won. For now. He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers deliberately, and disappeared around the corner toward the stairwell. His footsteps echoed in the silence he left behind. Ashley returned to the medication cart. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her breathing was perfectly controlled. Everything about her remained exactly as it had been before he'd arrived, because Captain Ashley Cooper, who had held a field hospital together in Baghdad with mortar rounds landing 30 meters away, who had made decisions about life and death while bleeding from shrapnel wounds, who had carried soldiers out of kill zones with bullets passing close enough to part her hair, did not have the luxury of fear. Fear was a luxury for people who had something safe left to lose. She had already lost everything. The night shift continued. Medications distributed. Vital signs monitored. Patients cared for with the same precision she brought to every moment of every day, the kind of care that asked for nothing in return except to be allowed to do it again tomorrow. But tomorrow was coming closer to the moment when everything would collapse. The call came through the dispatch radio at 2:08 p.m. Peterson Air Force Base. Training accident. Multiple trauma. Navy SEAL commander down. ETA 12 minutes. The ER went from routine to controlled chaos in the space of 3 seconds. Nurses moved like a school of fish turning in unison, each one knowing their lane, each one knowing what was coming. Ashley heard the announcement and felt something shift in her chest, the same sensation she'd felt 1,000 times before, the moment right before you stop being a nurse and start being a soldier again. She was already moving. Trauma Bay 3. The crash cart rolled smoothly on its wheels, the sound it made like distant thunder. Airway kit. Chest tube tray. The blood warmer humming its mechanical breath. Her hands knew the choreography without her mind having to direct them. 14 years of muscle memory, 8 of them spent in places where you learn to work by the sound of mortar fire and the smell of diesel fuel mixing with copper blood. Pierce appeared in the doorway like a man who'd been waiting for this exact moment. His jaw was set, his posture straight, the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to question whether the room would listen to him. He was already pulling on gloves, already positioning himself at the head of the bed before the patient had even arrived. I'll lead, he said. Not a request. You manage equipment. Hand me whatever I ask for. Nothing more. Ashley didn't respond. She never did. The unit patch was still tucked inside her jacket lining, the fabric worn soft from 17 years of being carried next to her ribs. Every time she put on scrubs, she was choosing to be what everyone saw, a nurse, competent but subordinate, helpful but ultimately invisible. The choice never got easier. It just got quieter. The Black Hawk's rotors shook the windows as the patient rolled through the bay doors. The sound was loud enough to feel in your teeth, that deep percussion that never left your nervous system once you'd heard it from the inside of a helicopter. The paramedics called out vitals like they were reading from a script they'd performed 100 times. Male, 34, unconscious, multiple blunt force trauma to chest and abdomen, respiratory distress, suspected pneumothorax, baseline BP 118/72, current BP 98/62 and dropping. The commander's navy fatigues were already cut away, his chest exposed. The asymmetry was immediate, one side rising higher than the other, the breathing labored and wrong, like a man trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. His neck veins were distended. Tracheal deviation. Everything screamed what was happening in his thoracic cavity, but Pierce was already reaching for the ultrasound probe, already moving toward imaging. "Get me a chest X-ray," Pierce said. "Rule out rib fractures first. We need baseline imaging before we—" "Tension pneumothorax," Ashley said quietly. Her voice was steady. It always was. "Right side. Asymmetric chest wall, JVD, tracheal deviation. He needs decompression now." Pierce's head snapped toward her like she'd spoken in a language that should have been impossible. His eyes went flat, the kind of flat that came right before something sharp. The grizzled paramedic who'd brought the patient in, name tag reading Holloway, combat vet written into the set of his shoulders, watched the exchange the way you watch a chess match played by people who are very, very good. "I'm not taking medical direction from a nurse," Pierce said. His voice was measured, controlled, the kind of tone that made it sound reasonable even though it wasn't. "We follow protocol. We get imaging. Then we consult with cardiothoracic." The commander's oxygen saturation dropped. 87%. The monitor showed it like a sentence being written in real time. 83%. 78%. His lips were going the color of old bruises. His fingers, still visible above the sheet line, were turning the same shade, the kind of blue that meant the cells weren't getting what they needed, that the clock had started counting down in a way that wasn't metaphorical anymore. Ashley's hands were already moving toward the crash cart. The needle was 14 gauge, the space between the second and third ribs the target. The technique was called a needle decompression, a 3-point entry at the midclavicular line that would puncture the parietal pleura and let the air out, the air that had turned into a pneumothorax and was now crushing the commander's lung the way a fist crushes a paper cup. "I said we follow protocol," Pierce repeated. His voice was louder now. He was positioning his body between Ashley and the patient, a deliberate blocking move that was supposed to communicate authority. It communicated something else instead. It communicated fear, the fear of a man who understood that the situation was deteriorating and that he was not equipped to handle it, and that there was someone in the room who was. Holloway stepped forward. The paramedic had that look on his weathered face, the look of a man who'd seen field medicine performed by people who'd learned it in places where the alternative was watching someone die. He watched Ashley's hands. He watched the way she moved toward the crash cart with a kind of grace that came from doing this in the dark, in the rain, in the back of a Humvee with rounds coming through the canvas and plasma bags leaking onto your boots. The commander's oxygen sat dropped to 72%. The monitor's alarm sang their electronic dirge. 68%. Pierce was still barking orders about imaging, still moving in the direction of bureaucracy when the patient needed immediate intervention. Ashley made her choice. The moment existed in that space where training meets necessity, where the protocols you've been handed intersect with the protocols you've lived through. She pushed past Pierce, not violently, just with the kind of straightforward determination that came from understanding exactly how much time was left, and reached for the scalpel from the crash cart tray. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights like it had somewhere else to be. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that falls when people realize they're watching something that changes the shape of the moment. Holloway saw it first, the way Ashley's hands moved, the way she located the space between the ribs with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, but not in an operating room. Not in a place that had protocols and oversight and committees and legal departments. She cut. One motion, practiced and certain. The incision was maybe 2 inches, between the 4th and 5th intercostal space, the needle going in at an angle that had a name in field medicine, the needle decompression at the midclavicular line, the 3-point entry that Holloway said was something he'd only ever seen once, in Fallujah, in a combat hospital that smelled like diesel and fear and the particular copper scent of blood that had been exposed to desert heat for too long. The hiss came next. The sound of air under pressure, the pneumothorax decompressing through the needle like breath finally being released after being held for too long. The commander's chest suddenly looked symmetrical again. The breathing changed. It became deeper, more real, the kind of breathing that meant the lungs were actually filling. The oxygen monitor climbed. 88%. 92%. 95%. Pierce was frozen in a position between standing and moving, his mouth slightly open, the kind of expression you got when your understanding of what was possible had just been rewritten in real time. Ashley was already moving to the next thing, securing the needle with tape, positioning the patient, her movements flowing like water, like muscle memory that had been carved into her nervous system by years of doing this when the alternative was unthinkable. The cardiothoracic surgeon arrived 47 minutes later, pushing through the bay doors with a kind of authority that came from knowing he was the most skilled person in the room. He looked at the work Ashley had done, the thoracotomy site, the placement, the way the chest was already beginning to stabilize, and his expression shifted through something complicated. Recognition. Professional respect. The kind of thing a surgeon recognizes when they see surgery performed by someone who understood not just the mechanics but the desperation, the calculus, the understanding that sometimes you don't have 90 minutes and you have to work with what you have. He said nothing. But Holloway saw it. The paramedic who'd done combat medicine in Fallujah pulled Ashley aside as she was restocking the crash cart, his weathered face serious as a prayer. "Who taught you that three-point entry?" His voice was quiet, meant only for her. "I only saw that in Fallujah." 11 hours, 3 surgeons rotating, the hospital taking sniper fire, and one of them, he stopped. He was looking at her hands now, really looking at them, the way you look at someone when you realize you know exactly who they are. "That was you." Ashley didn't answer. She didn't need to. The unit patch was still inside her jacket, still against her ribs, and suddenly there was another version of it visible in Holloway's understanding, the Marine Combat Hospital, the insurgent assault, the 11 hours of holding the line against people who wanted to silence the screaming. She turned back to the crash cart and began checking inventory with a kind of methodical focus that meant the moment was over, that the door was closing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pierce was already on his way to the administration offices, a stack of incident reports already drafted in his mind, each one cross-referenced with hospital policy codes, each one calculated to burn her to the ground before anyone could ask the right questions about where she'd learned what she'd just done. She scrubbed out with methodical precision, her hands moving through the motion she'd performed 1,000 times before, warm water, soap worked into the creases of her palms, between each finger, under the nails where blood still lingered despite the initial rinse. The surgical sink's chrome gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. The water ran clear now, spiraling down the drain like her 8 months at Cedar Creek Medical evaporating in real time. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway before she'd finished drying her hands. He held a stack of papers, each one crisp and white, each one a carefully constructed weapon. His face wore the expression of a man who'd finally cornered something he'd been hunting. Not satisfaction. Precision. The look of a surgeon preparing to cut. "You just ended your career," he said, his voice carrying the coldness of someone who'd already rehearsed this moment in the mirror. He didn't enter the room fully, just positioned himself where she'd have to face him to leave. The power move of someone who still believed he had all the power. "I've documented everything." Violation of scope of practice. Performing surgery without credentials. Endangering a patient. He held up the stack. Each form cross-referenced with hospital policy codes. Sections for .2.7, 5.1.3, 6.8.1. Copies are going to the Board of Directors, Risk Management, and your nursing supervisor this afternoon. Ashley didn't respond. Didn't look at the papers. Just continued drying her hands with the paper towel, pressing it between her fingers with the same care she'd used on the thoracotomy site 30 minutes earlier. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. "You performed surgery, Ms. Cooper." Surgery. Without a medical degree. Without authorization. Without even basic credentialing. Pierce's voice rose slightly, the cadence of a man accustomed to people defending themselves, to emotion, to cracking under pressure. "I have documented everything." The incision. The rib retraction. The procedure itself. You'll be lucky if you keep your nursing license after this. She could have defended herself. Could have explained that what she'd done was emergency medicine, that the commander would have died in the 90 minutes before the cardiothoracic surgeon arrived, that his oxygen saturation was 42% when she made the first incision. Could have cited the doctrine of necessity, the principle that a healthcare provider can override standard scope of practice when a patient's life hangs in the balance. She could have done all of that. But she couldn't explain how a registered nurse knew the precise anatomical landmarks for a left anterolateral thoracotomy. Couldn't explain the muscle memory that had guided her knife through tissue she'd sewn back together in field hospitals from Fallujah to Sanjin Valley. Couldn't explain the muscle memory that belonged to someone with a rank far above nurse, with 3 tours sewn into her bones, with a classified security clearance that would shatter if she opened her mouth. The mission came first. It always had. "I'm accepting your resignation," Pierce continued, watching for the crack, the flinch, the moment when the carefully constructed facade would splinter. His eyes were hungry for it. "Effective immediately. The hospital's legal team will draft the separation agreement. You'll need to return all hospital property, badge, credentials, parking pass, uniforms. You have 1 hour." Ashley crumpled the paper towel and dropped it into the trash. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were the color of something very old and very calm, like the ocean on a day when the wind has stopped and the water is thinking about something else entirely. "Where do I sign?" she said. Not a question. 3 words. Flat as a runway. Pierce's mouth tightened. He'd expected something else. Anger. Pleading. The sound of a career crumbling. What he got instead was the voice of someone who'd already accepted far worse. The hospital administrator, a thin man named Hendricks whose entire job seemed to consist of avoiding liability, called her into his office at 2:08 p.m. The separation agreement was already printed, waiting on his desk like a sentence already pronounced. Ashley signed her name on line 7, her signature identical to the one on her nursing credentials. "Steady. Present. Gone. Security will walk you to your locker," Hendricks said, not meeting her eyes. "We appreciate your service to Cedar Creek Medical, but given the circumstances, we've determined that accepting your resignation is in the best interest of all parties." That evening, the basement laundry facility smelled like industrial detergent and the particular staleness of a place where moisture and heat had met and decided to stay. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the sound of insects dying slowly, 1 volt at a time. The humming was rhythmic. Almost meditative. Almost like a funeral march. Ashley folded her scrubs. She'd folded uniforms before, combat fatigues after 12-hour shifts in Baghdad, dress whites before heading to the flight deck. But this was different. This was the final performance of a role she'd inhabited for 8 months, and the laundry worker glancing nervously at her from across the room had no idea he was watching a tactical withdrawal. The scrubs were still warm from the industrial dryer. She smoothed out each wrinkle with deliberate precision, the sleeves first, folded in thirds, then the torso, the pants. Each fold was a goodbye to something. The name tag that had read A. Cooper, RN was already peeled away, leaving a faint rectangular outline where the adhesive had been. She'd become invisible in the official sense. Just another folded uniform on a return cart. Her jacket hung over the back of a nearby chair, the faded unit patch still sewn inside the lining, the only thing she'd kept from Baghdad besides the scars that didn't show and the memories that wouldn't leave. The patch was barely visible now, just a shadow beneath the interior fabric, a ghost of who she'd been before she became someone else. Her fingers brushed the spot once, just once, a gesture so small the laundry worker wouldn't have noticed even if he was watching. She placed the folded scrubs on the return counter. They sat there in a neat stack, uniform blue, and lifeless without the body that had inhabited them. That was the final indignity, returning her uniform like a soldier discharged without honor, erased from the roster, her 8-month mission now compromised by a man who'd spent those months sharpening his paperwork like a blade. She'd walked into Cedar Creek Medical with a classified security clearance and a mission: monitor the cardiac ward for a supply chain conspiracy, identify the personnel involved, collect evidence. Instead, she'd caught the attention of someone too small to see the full picture and too threatened by her competence to leave it alone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the commander was still in the ICU, still healing from an injury that should have ended him. And she couldn't check on him. Couldn't monitor his progress. Couldn't walk past his room without triggering security alerts that would document her presence and create questions neither of them could answer. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce was, at this very moment, sitting in his office with incident reports stacked on his desk like a completed puzzle, each piece fitting together to form the image of a nurse who'd overstepped, who'd exceeded her credentials, who'd endangered a patient. The truth was scattered somewhere beneath those papers, waiting to be classified. But until then, she was just another healthcare professional removed from the roster for incompetence. She couldn't resist. Ashley knew it was a mistake the moment the decision crystallized in her mind, knew it violated everything she'd been trained to do: maintain cover, avoid deviation, minimize exposure. But she'd cut a man open with a blade designed for field dressing, and she needed to know he was breathing. The ICU corridor was quiet at 8:43 p.m. Visiting hours had ended. The night shift was settling into their routines, the familiar patterns of monitored sleep and medication administration. She wore street clothes now: jeans, a dark sweater, her jacket with the invisible patch. Just another person walking through a hospital, nothing remarkable, no badge to draw attention. The commander's room was at the end of the east corridor. She could see the Marine security guard from 30 feet away, posted outside the door with the bearing of someone trained for exactness. But hospitals were labyrinths if you knew the architecture, and she'd spent 8 months learning the emergency exits, the staff passages, the supply room that connected to the ICU through an unlocked service door. She slipped in through that door. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of monitors displaying the steady rhythm of a man's recovery: oxygen saturation 98%, heart rate 72, blood pressure 118/76. All the numbers that meant life continuing instead of ending. The commander's eyes were open. They'd been closed when she'd left him in the recovery room, sedated under propofol, his body still processing the violence she'd inflicted on it to save it. But his eyes were open now, tracking the slow progression of the fall line, the rise and fall of his chest beneath the hospital gown, everything working exactly as it should because the field thoracotomy had held, because the technique she'd learned in Baghdad had transferred perfectly to a trauma bay in Denver. His eyes shifted. Found her in the darkness. Recognition moved across his face like a door opening to a room he'd thought was sealed. His pupils dilated slightly, the physical response of a man's brain processing something impossible. His hand moved toward the call button, then stopped. His mouth opened, and the words that came out were soft and careful, shaped like a question. Phantom. The Marine's hand moved slower than his reflexes. 1 second to process the name. 1 second to understand exactly who was standing in the ICU doorway. His fingers found the phone clipped to his belt with the precision of a man trained to move in darkness. Ashley stood motionless, her face a portrait of stone, but the commander's eyes had already traveled the distance between her face and her hands, scarred hands, steady hands, hands that bore the signature of every life they'd held together in places where death came wearing 100 different uniforms. Phantom, he whispered again, and the name hung in the recycled hospital air like a prayer someone forgot they'd been holding. The Marine didn't ask for permission. He pulled up the citation database on his phone, thumbs moving across the screen with military efficiency. His voice came out flat, matter-of-fact, the tone of a man reading inventory. Captain Ashley Cooper. Navy Cross. For holding a field hospital in Baghdad for 11 hours against insurgent assault. Jolan District. 2009. He paused, scrolled. Silver Star. 2010. Another scroll. Second Silver Star. 2012. He looked up at Ashley. Purple Heart. Twice. The numbers stacked like building blocks, each one a year she'd spent beneath the surface, camouflaged in scrubs and humility. The commander's breathing had changed, slower, deliberate, the way it becomes when a man realizes he's been saved twice by the same hands, once on an operating table and once in a hospital that still echoed with the sound of incoming fire. The ICU monitor beeped its steady rhythm. 3:33 p.m. Outside, Denver's afternoon traffic moved like blood through arteries, nobody aware that the entire architecture of a man's understanding had just shifted on its axis. Dr. Pierce didn't walk through the door. He burst through it like something detonated behind his eyes, a malpractice attorney trailing behind him, expensive suit moving faster than his words could catch up. The attorney was already speaking, unauthorized surgical intervention, scope of practice violation, immediate cessation of premises access, building the wall of language that was supposed to make Ashley disappear again. But the Marine was still reading. Multiple accommodations commendations. Battlefield promotions approved by Joint Special Operations Command. Clearance level classified. He looked at Pierce. She was never just a nurse, sir. The attorney's jaw tightened. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. The Navy captain arrived 43 minutes later. They heard the helicopter rotors first, that distinctive whump-whump-whump that made the hospital windows vibrate like they were holding their breath. He came through the ambulance bay doors in dress whites, his uniform sharp enough to cut every medal in exactly the right place, a walking argument against chaos, against the kind of carelessness that Pierce had been building his entire career upon. He walked past the attorney without looking. Walked past Pierce without acknowledgement. Stopped directly in front of Ashley, and his right hand came up in a salute so precise it sounded like a single word spoken in a language only warriors understood. The fist came to chest. Captain Cooper. Welcome back to active service. He turned to Pierce then, and his voice came out quiet and lethal as a knife sliding between ribs. The investigation into Dr. Marcus Pierce is now a matter of military jurisdiction. You will remain available for questioning. The attorney started to speak. The captain's eyes moved to him once, briefly, with the expression of a man looking at something he'd already decided wasn't worth his time. The NCIS agents arrived within the hour. 2 of them, then 4, then 6, moving through Cedar Creek Medical like they owned it. They set up in a second-floor conference room with cardboard boxes and laptops, the kind of methodical efficiency that said they'd done this 100 times and would do it 100 more. They brought Gerald Hoffman's testimony first, the cardiac patient Ashley had been monitoring all along, the man whose supply requisitions had been so generous they bordered on impossible. Hoffman cut a deal. He always did. And in cutting that deal, he opened the files opened the patterns, and the patterns opened the world Pierce had been building in the margins. Forged signatures. Altered inventory logs. Falsified patient records constructed to justify supply requests that had nothing to do with patient care. Surgical shortcuts documented in his private notes, skip pre-flight protocol, patient outcome acceptable despite deviation, no need for second opinion on routine case. 23 cases. 31 cases. 42 if you counted the borderline ones. Each one a small decision to cut corners, a small theft from the kind of diligence that separates competence from carelessness. Pierce had been approving the excessive orders. Hoffman's network had been rerouting them. They'd split the proceeds, $847,000 over the course of 18 months, money that moved through accounts in Denver, Las Vegas, and Singapore. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was a confession written in supply chains and financial transfers and the small betrayals that accumulate when a man starts believing he's smarter than the rules. The hospital board suspended him within 72 hours. His medical license entered review proceedings. The state medical board opened an investigation. His academic publications began attracting scrutiny. Did the data match the methodology? Did the patient outcomes he'd reported actually occur? Or had he fabricated those too? Staff members he'd manipulated started coming forward, one by one, like dominoes finally allowed to fall. Nurses described how he'd pressured them to sign off on questionable decisions. Residents talked about the way he'd blamed them for mistakes that were his. One surgical tech mentioned a time he'd asked her to falsify anesthesia records. They'd all resisted. but they'd all felt the weight of his position, his access, his ability to determine whether they got promoted or stuck at the bottom of the hierarchy. And one by one, they began understanding that they hadn't been allies. They'd been weapons. Pierce had shaped them into instruments, and Ashley had been his target all along. She had to disappear so that he could continue his small thefts, his careful corner-cutting, his slow transformation of himself from doctor into something smaller and hungrier. The nurses who'd avoided her in the break room started finding her in hallways, their shame moving like heat off asphalt, their words stumbling over apologies that couldn't quite reach the thing they were trying to fix. Ashley accepted each one with the same stoic nod, her face revealing nothing. Just the same slight acknowledgement, a dip of the chin, eyes level, that seemed to accept the apology without forgiving it. She wasn't there to forgive. She was there to survive. And she was doing that with the same precision she'd used to hold a field hospital together while mortar fire rained down outside. The hospital offered her the ER director position. Public rehabilitation. A plea to salvage reputation. She declined with 3 words spoken quietly in the administrator's office, "I'm not a nurse." A pause. "I never was." Naval Intelligence reassigned her to Walter Reed, where her rank and skills aligned, where the disguise could finally come off. But before she left Denver, she had one piece of business remaining, something unfinished that had nothing to do with missions or paperwork or the machinery of military justice. She needed to collect the personal items she'd left in storage. She needed to see Cedar Creek Medical one final time. Not as a nurse. As herself. 6 weeks later, she returned to the ambulance bay. Not in scrubs. Civilian clothes, dark jacket, jeans, boots that had never known hospital floors. The early October wind moved through Denver cold enough to bite, carrying the smell of rain coming across the plains, the kind of weather that reminds you seasons actually change if you give them time. She saw Dr. Pierce through the chain-link fence of the loading dock. He was wearing a polo shirt and khakis, loading boxes into a medical supply van. Generic white boxes. The kind that contained gauze and bandages and all the small machinery of healing that he was no longer permitted to touch directly. His physician's license was suspended. His academic reputation destroyed. Every position of authority stripped away. Reduced to the exact supply chain his negligence had compromised, checking shipments, counting inventory, moving boxes that he would never understand the weight of again. He didn't notice her watching. His movements were mechanical, efficient in the way that comes from having done something so often it stops requiring thought. A man performing the motion of a life, not living it. Ashley stood there at the fence line, her hand steady at her sides, her jaw set the way it had been for 8 months, the way it had been for 12 years before that. The faded unit patch was sewn inside her locker now, back at Walter Reed where it belonged, where her rank and call sign were printed on access badges instead of whispered as legend. The commander appeared beside her, walking with a cane, his recovery nearly complete. He'd been discharged but returned for physical therapy, the kind of dedicated rehabilitation that comes when a man understands he was saved by someone extraordinary and wants to earn the right to walk again. "You saved my life twice," he said quietly, his eyes following her gaze toward the loading dock. "Once on that table. Once in Baghdad when you held that hospital." Ashley didn't respond immediately. They watched Pierce load another box, his shoulders already beginning to show the hunch of a man realizing his life had become smaller than his ambitions. "He tried to destroy you with paperwork," the commander continued, his voice like something carved from granite. "And it destroyed him instead." The slightest shift at the corner of Ashley's mouth. Not quite a smile, but close, there and gone in a heartbeat, a moment of emotional transparency that lasted exactly the duration of a breath. "Karma has good aim," she said simply. They walked toward the parking lot together, the commander moving with deliberate care, each step a small victory against the pneumothorax that should have killed him. At the edge of the asphalt, he paused. "The Navy's offering you a commendation. Full ceremony. Media, families, the whole architecture." He waited. "Thought you should know." Ashley shook her head. "I don't need another medal." "What do you need?" "Another mission." He understood. Some warriors don't fight for recognition. They fight because fighting is the only language that makes sense to them, because the world keeps breaking and they keep putting it back together, because the alternative, standing still, accepting praise, admitting that 8 months of humiliation might have cost her something, felt like drowning. As they reached her car, the commander offered one final observation, his voice quiet and filled with the kind of respect that comes from knowing exactly what someone has sacrificed. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Ashley nodded once. She climbed into her car and drove toward whatever came next, knowing that Dr. Pierce was loading boxes in a parking lot, knowing that his career had become nothing but inventory management, knowing that the very supply chain he'd tried to manipulate had become his prison. No badge. No authority. No way forward except the one he'd already burned. If you've made it this far, you know the truth about heroes. They don't announce themselves. They don't need recognition. They just keep moving forward, doing what needs doing, saving lives in the places nobody else will look. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the quiet warriors among us. Like this video if you believe honor matters. Comment below, what would you have done in Ashley's position? Would you have saved Pierce too, or walked away? The answer says everything about who you are.